Even in the 1840s, it was not easy to trick the leaders of the Somali. In this video, I'm going to read an article written by one Lieutenant Wilmot Christopher, who led a team of British officers through or in a ship to explore the Somali coast. And in that expedition or in that travel or that trip, he went into several of the city-states and sultanates that existed in 1843. Now, in this part I'm going to read is discussing going to the Geledi Sultanate and him meeting one Sheikh Yusuf Mohammed, who was a sultan during this time. And in fact, the reason why I decided to read this article is because of the book that I read previously, a book written by one Virginia Luning, where she discusses a lot or gives us a lot of stories about Yusuf Mohammed, the Sultan of Geledi in the 1840s. Now, there's a part where Wilmot Christopher, Lieutenant, tells us about a conversation he was having with both Yusuf Mohammed and his brothers, two brothers, and then later on a brother of the Sultan visited him early in the morning, and they had even more conversations. And in these conversations, he figured out that the brother of the Sultan was trying to interrogate him in ways that did not seem like he was being interrogated. Seems like the Sultan and his brothers were interested in really understanding what was Wilmot Christopher trying to do. We are going to read that part. It's a very, very interesting conversation they were having. Now, before I read that part, let me read another part in the same region of the article where Wilmot Christopher brings up something that I've talked about a lot in the videos that I've done about the position of women in African societies and how Europeans often will have this misunderstanding of African societies, especially regarding the position of women. And he's going to tell us the position of women in the Somali society in the 1840s, that is. And this is what he writes. The housewife of this community do not use a needle. No part of their dress requires it. Thus the fair are clothed as much as the women of India, and to judge by their liveliness in the dance and their really keeping time in musical efforts, they hold a more rational position in the Somali society than they do among other Mohammedan nations, allowedly more civilized in most respects. So he says that he observed, and there was a celebration he attended, and there was this celebration going on. It was a religious celebration, and then he describes how the women wore dress and things like that, and it's telling us that they used to put on garments that did not need to be, of course, seamed. And in doing that, he tells us about how they behaved during the celebrations and going by how their liveliness, as he described it, and also how everything was going on. He concluded that they held a more rational position. Now, that's a very interesting way to phrase it, a more rational position. Of course, meaning maybe they have more say in the society than it is in most other societies, including what he calls, of course, the Mohammedan nations. And he says that, of course, meant, or to him, that said that this society was more civilized in that regard. Now, let's read about him being interrogated by Yusuf Mohammed and his brother, and they interrogate him in a very stealth manner. And I mean stealth, like they did not want to spook him. They did not want him to realize that they are interrogating him. So they do it in a very clever way. But then he realized that they are trying to trick him into telling them why he was there. Now, let's read. But he starts with telling us who Yusuf Mohammed was. He's going to describe him as a person, and then he's going to tell us about his interaction with him. And then we are going to see that part where the brother of Yusuf Mohammed comes early in the morning, and then he throws around questions that then Wilmot tells us that he realized that this was a trick that was being used on him. Now, let's read and see. He says, the chief is a tall man with an intelligent countenance, about 45 years old, dressed only in a large white cloth loosely thrown around his person and brought over the head and shoulders so as to envelop the whole body from the ankles to the crown of the head. He wore sandals and had a small spear in his hand and the eternal toothbrush, stick usually used in Africa. It is that stock of the Salvadora Pasica rack of the Arabs. So he's describing this man. He's tall, about 45 years of age. That is the Sultan of the Geledi Sultanate in 1840s. He tells us how he dressed. He had this shuka, we can say in East Africa, we can say shuka. He had sandals on, and then he had this toothbrush, which is very common among the Somalis, stands out, but also very common in East Africa, the Maasais, Kikuyus. Like traditionally, people used to have that stick for cleaning your teeth, and you'll have it maybe throughout the day, basically. He says his head was shaven and he had a scant beard around the edge of the lower part of the face, the mustachios, the imperial, and all the stray hairs of the cheeks being carefully plucked out by the roots, such being the universal custom with the Somali nation to which this chief belonged. So he's basically describing to us this person, Yusuf Mohammed. Then he continues, judging him and the principal people here, the Somalis are not thick-lipped race. They are black with crisp hair, straight noses, and well-proportioned heads. Of course, this is 1840s, the 19th century. During this time, your physical appearance mattered a lot in regard to whether they are going to decide where you fall in the racial hierarchy. Some of the features, of course, that the Europeans used to look at beside your skin color, they will look at your hair, of course. They will look at the shape of your nose, and of course, the lips and the jaws. These are features that during this time were very important. Not like today, people don't really pay attention to those things. But during this time, this was very important, and that's why he's making that description, saying that the Somalis, they are not of thick lip. Of course, thick lip, you get what he means there. Then he continues, features and limbs in the lower order, there is so great a mixture of the slaves and the Oromos that it is impossible to distinguish them from each other. So, and we've gone through this, the Somali society, specifically in the Geledi, there was this ranking of members of the society. There were the nobles at the top, and then there were others and others in that order. That's what he's basically bringing up here, that there were, of course, the noble Somalis, and then there were others, there were slaves, and then there were others. Now he's talking of the lower order, meaning the citizens at the bottom, that there used to be a lot of mixing, while at the top you could see a clear physical appearance that was unique, but the lower down you went, the less that became the case. That's what basically he's saying. He brings up something that Virginia Luling does not really mention, really. Actually, Virginia Luling does mention the Oromos being part of that society, but not in a large extent. But seems like Wilmot Christopher, lieutenant as he was called, seems to say that there was a huge mixing of Oromos and other peoples at the lower level of the society. Then he continued, as the noble-looking chief watched the present arms of the musketeers, he was evidently discomposed. His eyes anxiously flitted from one soldier to the other, and he no doubt felt relieved when they were marched off. Now that's important. Of course, he arrives, he has his own soldiers, they decide to do some salute for Yusuf Mohammed. But Yusuf Mohammed is very uncomfortable because he doesn't know what are these people really up to. And it's only when he realizes that they are leaving from that performance that he becomes a little bit relieved that, yeah, something has not gone wrong. Now, this is where that conversation between Yusuf Mohammed's brother and Lieutenant Wilmot Christopher happens, that where the brother is trying to gauge him. And this is what he writes. The chief's brother made me a private visit and proposed to me to assist him and land with 100 Europeans at Mingma or Minguya and establish it as the grain port of this coast. Now, that's a request that the brother of Yusuf Mohammed makes to Wilmot Christopher, that I want you to help me. And I want we go to Minguya, which was somewhere along the coast, and you help me establish a port there. This is what Wilmot says after that request was made. I conceive this was not asked in sincerity, but was said merely to ascertain my object in wishing to see Galwain. So Wilmot realizes that this request is not a sincere request. This is a request that has been made to me to try to gauge me, to try to find out why am I here, what am I doing here, to try to figure out if I'm here because I'm planning something that will go against these people. Then he continues, the chief came over to my quarters the next previous to my leaving his town and remained for 3 hours conversing very familiarly, asking questions indicating a great desire for further intimacy with and information regarding Europeans. Then another day, Yusuf Mohammed comes and they're having this conversation. And you can tell from this conversation that this was still that process of trying to gauge him. He's asking him a lot of questions about Europeans, about different things, and then suggesting that he was interested in building this relationship with the British. But you can tell that probably was trying to gauge him, to see his reactions and to try to figure out what was this man all about. Then he continues, everything I heard to the knitting of a stocking, I explained as carefully and clearly as I could. So he asks him very many questions, including questions that you'll think they are not important, but they were important. In fact, this particular part is brought up by Virginia Luling in her book that Yusuf Mohammed, the Sultan of Geledi, was so much interested in learning everything he could from this person before him. And so he was asking all the questions, including questions about the stockings that Wilmot was wearing and things like that. The lion's head on the hilt of the uniform sword struck him as so peculiarly appropriate that he harangued the bystanders for some minutes on its emblematic meaning. This is very interesting, actually. He sees this lion's head on the uniform, could be maybe on the arm or maybe it was on the chest. It's not very clear, but there was these lion heads on the clothes that Wilmot was wearing, and it struck him as very appropriate, like it said something. And he went on this speech telling his people about it and probably explaining it to them and how important it was and all that. Of course, Wilmot probably did not understand what he was saying because most likely he was speaking in his own language to his people. Now he goes into describing or giving us even more description of Yusuf, the Sultan. He says his own shoes were made of camel leopard's skin, his dress of cotton, the growth and manufacture of the country. So there used to be a lot of cotton grown in Geledi, southern Somali region. So these were clothes that were manufactured locally. Of course, the amulet he wore around the right arm was very neatly plaited of narrow strips of delicate skins of salt antelope, stained a dull red. His food is milk and fresh meat, with stewed coffee and millet in the morning. So he even tells us what the Sultan used to eat, what he had on in terms of, we can say, ornaments. He also tells us no Somali eats flesh unless he has lost all self-respect. I don't understand what this was really. I think this could be a typo. I don't understand this line. I was trying to understand what this line means. I don't know what it means actually, because my understanding is Somali eat a lot of flesh. But he says unless he has lost his self-respect, many do not learn to eat even grain. Probably meant they eat a lot of flesh, but they sometimes have to eat the grain. I don't know what that line, maybe it's a typo thing, probably. He continues, they are essentially a pastoral people, of course. That then should mean they eat a lot of flesh. Then he continues, the chief and his two brothers, Sheikh Musa and Haji Ibrahim, are all 6 feet in height or upwards, well formed, with aquiline noses, fine lips, but crisped hair. Of course, again, we're coming back to those physical features. And this meant something to Wilmot because by looking at, of course, the height, then we move on. That means these people are very tall, actually. 6 feet is very tall. And then when he says well formed, of course, he's saying their features were closer to the European look. Probably that's what he means. That's how I see it. When he says aquiline noses, of course, are the noses we can say maybe of European and Arabs and people. Maybe you could say Caucasia kind of people have aquiline noses, and then fine lips, of course, it means thin lips, not large lips like the rest of Africans have. Then, of course, crimped hair. So he gives us that description. Now, what caught my attention in this section, of course, is that we could say diplomatic judo that was happening between Yusuf the Sultan and Wilmot and the brother of the Sultan. It looks like there was a lot of suspicion even during the providing the honor to the Sultan through the march of the soldiers. There was a lot of mistrust, and then the Sultan was trying to figure out what's going on and probably send the brother like, can you go and try to dig this person, see what they can tell you, and then he tries it himself. So that's very interesting because This is mid 19th century. This is the time, the beginning of the Europeans coming to Africa. And what happened after that? There was a lot of conmanship that happened, and I've talked about that a lot on this channel. There was conmanship that was happening throughout Africa. Europeans were coming with bogus documents and then having them signed by just anybody, really. In some cases, they were picking just strangers and telling them, now you are the chief, sign this document. People don't know what they are signing. They are given some presents. They sign off some land, huge tracts of land, without even realizing that actually they've given up their land to Europeans without realizing. And then the Europeans go to Europe and they show these letters that have been signed, these contracts. Look, we signed contracts with Africans and they've given us their land, things like that. But looks like at least this one Somali leader was very cautious. But it's not just him, because when you read this entire article, there are so many. Some of them did not even want him to come to their Commonwealth. Yusuf decided to welcome him, but you can see he was also very cautious, and he was keen on trying to find out what is this man up to. And the same party talks about Yusuf inviting him to join him on a campaign that he was going against the Bardere, which is also a very interesting request. Again, going by how we've seen, or what we've seen here, I suspect that that was another request that was not a genuine request. Probably it was a request that was a trap, I'm thinking. But Wilmot most likely, of course, saw it, or maybe he did not see it, because he explained that he told him, I can't do that because I don't have instructions from my seniors to do any of that. Now, if you want this book, check the pinned comment or check the bio if you are watching on TikTok, and you can go buy your copy. It has like 7 articles. They are long articles. All these articles were published between 1830 and 1890, and all these articles are about travelers to the lands of the Somalis, just like Wilmot. And you're going to find very interesting stuff in those articles. Actually, I compiled those articles into this book. So go buy it, and by buying it, of course, you also, of course, you're supporting what I do, and I really, really, really appreciate. Those are my random thoughts.